When Leah Carter's best friend is wrongfully arrested, she uncovers a web of corruption within the police force, led by the untouchable Captain Andrews. As Leah, the mayor's daughter, fights to expose the truth, she faces powerful enemies, dangerous threats, and a system built to silence her. Will she bring justice to her city, or be crushed by those protecting their secrets? Watch to find out, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and justice. Drop a comment with your thoughts on what might happen next. Leah Carter stepped out of her sleek black sedan and took a deep breath. The cool morning air was crisp with the scent of wet pavement as light rain began to drizzle. Adjusting her sharp navy blue blazer, Leah squared her shoulders and straightened her posture, her heels clicking against the pavement as she made her way toward the towering police precinct. Today wasn't just another day at her law office or a meeting with city officials. Today, Leah was on a mission. Inside, emotions stirred beneath her calm exterior: anger, frustration, and a determination that she could not suppress. Her best friend, Daniel Richards, had been wrongfully detained the previous night. Leah couldn't shake the memory of his panicked phone call, his voice trembling as he told her he'd been pulled over for a routine stop and then taken in without explanation. As the daughter of James Carter, the respected mayor of the city, Leah had never had to face such overt injustice herself. She was privileged, and she knew it. But watching her closest friend suffer at the hands of the system ignited a fire within her. It was no longer about her position or her father's influence. It was about standing up for what was right, for those who didn't have the same voice she did. And today, she was determined to use hers. Stepping through the glass doors of the precinct, Leah was greeted by the sharp smell of disinfectant and the low hum of conversation. She looked around, quickly scanning the room filled with officers and citizens. At the reception desk, a tall, broad-shouldered officer sat lazily behind a computer monitor. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, and he didn't bother to look up as she approached. Leah cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said firmly. The officer, his name tag reading Officer Tom Hanks, barely glanced at her before returning his gaze to the screen. "What do you need?" he asked dryly, his voice devoid of any warmth or interest. Leah exhaled, controlling the irritation rising within her. "I'm here to file a complaint. One of your officers unlawfully detained my friend last night." Officer Hanks sighed as if this were the most tiresome request he'd ever received. "You'll need to talk to Captain Andrews," he said, pointing toward a door at the end of the hallway without even lifting his head. "He handles complaints." Leah felt her jaw clench. This was not going to be easy. Leah made her way down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the cold, sterile walls. Each step brought her closer to the confrontation she knew was coming. She paused for a moment in front of the door, labeled Captain Phil Andrews, gathering her composure. Inside, her heart raced, but she couldn't let that show. She was a lawyer, after all, and today she would need every ounce of professionalism and strength she possessed. She knocked twice, firm but polite. "Come in!" a gruff voice barked from the other side. Leah opened the door and stepped into the office. Captain Phil Andrews, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a face that looked as though it had never smiled, sat behind a large wooden desk. He didn't look up from the paperwork scattered in front of him. "I'm Leah Carter," she began, standing tall. "I'm here to file a formal complaint about an unlawful arrest." Captain Andrews finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a flicker of annoyance. "A complaint?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Another one? What's it this time?" Leah took a steadying breath. "My friend, Daniel Richards, was pulled over last night without cause and detained. I believe his rights were violated, and I'm requesting an investigation." Andrews leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "And you believe this why? Because your friend told you?" He smirked, the condescension in his tone unmistakable. "People get detained for all sorts of reasons, Miss Carter. Maybe your friend had something to hide." Leah felt her anger flare, but she kept her voice steady. "There was no cause for his detention. I've reviewed the legal protocols, and your officers did not follow them." Captain Andrews snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Look, sweetheart, we're not here to listen to every little complaint someone comes in with. We've got real work to do. Maybe you should go back to your nice office and leave the law enforcement to us." The insult hit Leah hard, but she wasn't about to back down. "I'm not leaving until you take this complaint seriously." The captain's expression hardened. "You think you can walk in here and demand we jump because of who your daddy is? I don't care who you are. You don't run this place." The words were like a slap in the face, but Leah refused to let them break her. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for justice. You have a duty to uphold the law, not trample over people's rights." For a moment, Andrews said nothing. He stared at Leah as if weighing how far he could push her. "I'm not wasting any more time on this," he finally said, standing up. "Now get out of my office before I have security remove you." Leah stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. But she knew this wasn't the time to escalate further. She needed to regroup, gather more support, and come back stronger. Without another word, she turned and left the office, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked out. But inside, the fire was only burning hotter. Later that evening, Leah sat in her father's study, the heavy oak desk between them. The room smelled of old leather and books, the kind of place where important decisions were made and lives were changed. James Carter, her father, sat across from her, his brow furrowed as he listened to her recount the events of the day. "So, he refused to even listen to you?" her father asked, his voice calm but laced with anger. Leah nodded, her frustration still raw. "He treated me like I was nothing, like my complaint was a waste of time. And worse, he mocked me. It was humiliating." Mayor Carter leaned back in his chair, his sharp blue eyes focused on his daughter. "Leah, you know as well as I do that power doesn't change overnight. People like Captain Andrews, men who think they can treat others however they want, have been part of the system for far too long." "I know that, Dad," Leah said, her voice quiet but firm. "But that doesn't make it right. Daniel doesn't deserve this. No one does." Her father nodded, his expression softening. "You're right. And you're doing the right thing by standing up for him. But you also need to be strategic. Sometimes fighting head-on isn't the way to win." Leah frowned. "So what am I supposed to do? Just let it go?" James Carter smiled faintly. "Of course not. But you need allies, Leah. You need to gather your resources, build your case, and when the time is right, strike where it hurts." Leah thought about his words, her frustration slowly morphing into resolve. Her father was right. She couldn't win this fight alone, but she wasn't going to back down either. Captain Andrews might think he had all the power, but Leah knew how to play the long game. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "I'll build my case, and I'll make sure Andrews pays for what he did." Her father nodded, his pride evident in his eyes. "That's my girl." Leah stood outside her father's study for a few minutes, the weight of his words lingering in her mind. She knew what she had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. As she stepped out of the house and into the night, the cool air helped to clear her thoughts. Daniel's face flashed through her mind, his wide, anxious eyes when he called her from that police station, his voice shaking with disbelief. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number of the one person she knew could help her navigate the next steps. Detective Ben Harris. Harris had been a friend of the family for years. Leah had known him since she was a teenager, when he'd often come over for dinner with her parents. He had always been someone she could trust, a man of integrity who had risen through the police ranks without losing his moral compass. But he was also someone who knew the system inside and out, including the flaws that plagued it. "Leah!" Harris's voice crackled through the phone after a few rings. "What's going on?" "It's late." "I'm sorry to call you so late, Ben, but I need your help," Leah said, her tone more urgent than she intended. Harris didn't hesitate. "What's wrong?" Leah quickly explained the situation, detailing Daniel's arrest, her encounter with Captain Andrews, and the frustration she felt trying to get anyone to take her complaints seriously. She knew she sounded desperate, but there was no room for pride now. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Harris spoke again, his voice filled with concern. "That's not surprising, unfortunately. Andrews has been running that precinct like his own private kingdom for years. Complaints get swept under the rug. But if your friend was detained without cause, that's something we can work with." Leah exhaled, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "Thank you. I don't know what else to do. He won't listen to me." "I can't promise this will be easy," Harris said, "but I'll help you. First thing tomorrow, I'll dig into the arrest record and see what I can find. We'll need evidence to back up any claim you want to file. Stay strong, Leah. We'll get through this." "Thanks, Ben. I really appreciate it," Leah replied softly. The relief she felt was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. But at least now, she wasn't in it alone. As she hung up the phone, Leah felt the spark of hope reignite. She would build her case methodically, with the help of someone who understood both sides of the system. And when she returned to confront Captain Andrews, she would be armed with facts and determination, not just emotion. The next morning, Leah arrived at the city courthouse, her briefcase in hand and her mind focused. Detective Harris had texted her earlier, letting her know that he had pulled the file on Daniel's arrest. As she walked through the towering marble pillars of the courthouse, the gravity of what she was doing settled deeper into her bones. She wasn't just fighting for Daniel, she was fighting against a system that for too long had ignored voices like hers. She found Harris waiting in one of the empty courtrooms, a folder in front of him on the table. His face was set in a grim expression as she approached. "I didn't expect it to be this bad," Harris said, pushing the folder toward her. "Take a look." Leah sat down and flipped through the documents inside. The arrest report was riddled with inconsistencies, vague descriptions, no clear probable cause, and discrepancies in the timeline. It was enough to make her blood boil, but she kept her composure. "This is a mess," Leah muttered, shaking her head. "They didn't even have a legitimate reason to pull him over in the first place." Harris nodded. Andrews and his officers know how to bend the rules just enough to avoid scrutiny. But this? This might be sloppy enough that we can use it to push forward. Leah scanned the rest of the file, her frustration mounting. So what's next? How do we get someone to actually take this seriously? "We'll need to file a formal report with the Internal Affairs Division," Harris said. "It'll trigger an investigation into the precinct's conduct. But be prepared. Andrews has a lot of friends in high places. He won't go down without a fight." Leah's stomach twisted at the thought, but she couldn't let fear stop her now. "I don't care how many people are protecting him. This has to be exposed." Harris gave her a reassuring smile. "Good. I'll help you file the report. And once it's in, the city will have no choice but to investigate." Leah nodded, a fierce determination settling over her. "Then let's do it." As they prepared the documents, Leah felt a surge of resolve. She was tired of being dismissed, tired of being told to let it go. With Harris by her side, she was going to make sure that the truth came to light, and that Captain Andrews would be held accountable for his actions. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings, legal paperwork, and tense phone calls. Leah filed the complaint with Internal Affairs, and to her relief, the report was accepted. It didn't take long for whispers to spread throughout the precinct, rumors of an investigation into Captain Andrews' conduct. Leah could feel the eyes of the city on her as she continued to push forward. The media had caught wind of her case, and local news outlets were beginning to ask questions. She gave carefully worded statements, making sure to highlight the injustice of Daniel's arrest without making any direct accusations that could jeopardize the investigation. But as much as Leah's case was gaining momentum, she knew that Andrews wouldn't go down without a fight. She could almost feel the storm brewing on the horizon. One evening, as Leah sat in her apartment going over the latest developments, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Detective Harris. "Harris, Andrews is pushing back. He's claiming Daniel was resisting arrest, but there's no evidence to support it. Stay strong. We've got the upper hand." Leah's pulse quickened. Of course, Andrews would try to twist the narrative, painting Daniel as a threat. But she had the evidence on her side, and she wasn't about to let Andrews manipulate the situation to his advantage. As Leah set her phone down, she stared out the window at the city skyline. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't alone in this. Harris had her back, and soon the truth would come out. Leah couldn't help but think about what her father had said. Sometimes, fighting head-on isn't the way to win. she had learned that lesson well. Instead of confronting Andrews directly and recklessly, she had built her case carefully, with precision and patience. And now, it was only a matter of time before the investigation would force Andrews to answer for his actions. The tension in the air was palpable, but Leah felt a sense of calm wash over her. The storm was coming, but she was ready for it. The day Leah had been preparing for finally arrived. The city was buzzing with whispers about the formal investigation into Captain Phil Andrews' conduct. Leah stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting her crisp white blouse. Her reflection showed the face of someone ready for battle, though the nerves in her stomach told a different story. She'd spent the last week building her case, gathering statements, and working with Detective Ben Harris to ensure that everything was airtight. The Internal Affairs Division IAD had officially launched their inquiry, and today was the day Leah would meet with them to present her findings. This was her chance to finally make her voice heard, to expose the corruption that had festered under Captain Andrews' leadership. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Harris. Harris, meeting is on at 10. Be ready. Andrews is going to push back hard. Leah sighed and quickly texted back. Leah, I'm ready. See you soon. She slipped her phone into her bag and took a deep breath before heading out the door. Today was crucial, but Leah felt the weight of everything she'd worked for pressing down on her. She knew Andrews wasn't going to make this easy, but with Harris by her side and the evidence on her side, Leah was determined not to back down. When she arrived at the precinct, the tension in the air was palpable. Officers moved around with purpose, but there was a buzz of quiet conversations and sidelong glances in her direction. They knew who she was and what she had come to do. Leah straightened her shoulders and walked toward the meeting room where the IAD officers would be waiting. She was met by Harris at the door, who gave her a nod of reassurance. Ready? He asked, his voice calm but serious. As ready as I'll ever be, Leah replied, steeling herself for what was to come. They entered the room together, and Leah immediately felt the weight of the gazes on her. Sitting at the table were two IAD officers, their expressions neutral, but their eyes sharp, as though they could see straight through her. Across from them, Captain Andrews sat with his arms crossed, his face set in a scowl. He didn't even bother to hide his disdain as he glared at Leah. Well, this should be interesting, Andrews muttered under his breath, loud enough for Leah to hear. Leah ignored him, focusing on the IAD officers. Thank you for meeting with me today, she said, keeping her voice steady. I've come here to present my formal complaint regarding the unlawful detention of Daniel Richards and the misconduct of Captain Andrews. One of the officers, a woman with a sharp jawline and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded. We've reviewed your initial report, Miss Carter. Please proceed with your additional findings. Leah took a deep breath and began her presentation. She laid out the inconsistencies in Daniel's arrest report, the lack of probable cause, and the blatant disregard for protocol by Andrews and his officers. As she spoke, she could feel Andrews' eyes burning into her, but she refused to let him intimidate her. For the first time, Leah had control over the narrative, and she wasn't going to waste it. Captain Andrews leaned forward in his seat, his scowl deepening as Leah finished her presentation. Are you done yet? He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. Because all I'm hearing is a lot of noise about nothing. Leah's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. This isn't nothing. You unlawfully detained an innocent man, Captain. The evidence is clear, Andrews scoffed, turning to the IAD officers. Look, we deal with thousands of cases a year. Not every arrest is going to be perfect, but that doesn't mean we're doing anything illegal. This woman, he gestured toward Leah, is trying to stir up trouble because she didn't get her way. Her friend was arrested, so now she's on a crusade. Leah could feel her anger rising, but she kept her voice steady. This isn't about getting my way. This is about justice. Your officers violated my friend's rights, and you refused to address it. That's not how the law works. Andrew's face darkened, his lips curling into a sneer. Oh, here we go. The daughter of the mayor thinks she can walk in here and tell us how to do our jobs. I've been running this precinct for 20 years. I don't need a lecture from some entitled lawyer who doesn't know the first thing about policing. Leah clenched her fists under the table. She had anticipated this. Andrews would try to turn this into a personal attack, deflecting attention away from his own wrongdoing. But Leah had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't about to let him control the conversation. "Captain Andrews," Leah said, her voice firm, "this isn't about me or who my father is. This is about the law, and no one, especially not you, is above that." The room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had paused, and all Leah could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Andrews's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, one of the IAD officers cleared his throat. "Captain, we're here to discuss the merits of the case, not personal grievances. Miss Carter has presented substantial evidence, and we will review it thoroughly. If there are discrepancies in the arrest report, we will investigate them." Leah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. Andrews might have been momentarily silenced, but he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. After the meeting concluded, Leah and Harris stepped out of the precinct, the tension between them still palpable. "Not bad in there," Harris said with a small smile. "You handled yourself well. Andrews didn't know what hit him." Leah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thanks, but I know this isn't over. He's going to come after me now, isn't he?" Harris's smile faded. "He might. Andrews is a stubborn man, and he's not used to being challenged. But you've got the upper hand right now. Just be careful. He has a lot of influence." Leah nodded, her mind already racing with what might come next. She had expected resistance, but Andrew's open hostility had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Still, she couldn't back down now. She had come too far. As they walked toward their cars, Leah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. Hesitating for only a second, she answered. "Leah Carter." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then a voice she instantly recognized. "Captain Andrews." "Listen, Carter," he growled. "I don't care who your father is. You think you can walk into my precinct and destroy my career? You've got another thing coming. Back off, or this won't end well for you." Leah's grip tightened on her phone, her knuckles turning white. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Are you threatening me, Captain?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Andrews chuckled darkly. "Take it however you want, sweetheart. But don't say I didn't warn you." The line went dead, and Leah stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her seemed to still, and for a brief moment, Leah felt a surge of fear. Andrews wasn't just playing games, he was serious. She lowered the phone and looked over at Harris, who had noticed the change in her expression. "What's wrong?" Leah shook her head slowly, her mind still reeling from the conversation. "He just threatened me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris's face darkened. "Andrews?" Leah nodded. Harris cursed under his breath, pulling out his own phone. "He's digging himself deeper. Don't worry, we'll handle this. But you need to be careful, Leah. He's desperate now, and that makes him dangerous." Leah swallowed hard, trying to shake off the lingering fear. She knew she couldn't let Andrews intimidate her, but his words had cut deep. Still, Leah wasn't about to back down. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. "I'm not backing off," Leah said firmly. "Not until he's held accountable for what he's done." Harris nodded, but his expression remained grim. "Good. But keep your guard up. This is only going to get tougher from here." As Leah drove home that evening, Andrew's words echoed in her mind. She knew the road ahead was filled with challenges, but she was more determined than ever to see this through. No matter what threats came her way, she was going to make sure justice was served. Leah woke up the next morning with a lingering sense of unease. Captain Andrews' voice still echoed in her mind, his threat clear and menacing. Despite her resolve, fear gnawed at her. She wasn't naive. She knew what men like Andrews were capable of, and now she had to walk a fine line between seeking justice and protecting herself. After a restless night, she checked her phone. No new messages. The silence was unnerving. She decided to go into work early, trying to get her mind off Andrew's threat by focusing on her growing pile of cases. When Leah arrived at her law office, the usual hum of activity was a welcome distraction. The familiar rhythm of phone calls, paper shuffling, and keyboard clacking helped ground her. She'd been practicing law for nearly 5 years, but none of her previous cases had prepared her for what she was now facing. As she sat at her desk, reviewing a contract for another client, her phone rang. It was Ben Harris. "Leah," Harris said, his voice tense. "We need to talk." "What's going on?" Leah asked, her stomach tightening. "It's Andrews. He's going after you now." Leah's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Harris sighed. "He's been talking to people in the department, spreading rumors. He's saying you're only doing this because you're the mayor's daughter, that this is some political stunt. He's trying to undermine you, make it look like you're using your connections for personal gain." Leah gripped the edge of her desk, anger flaring within her. "Of course he is. He can't attack the evidence, so he's attacking me." "That's not all," Harris continued. "He's been talking to reporters, too. There's going to be a story in tomorrow's paper. He's trying to make it seem like this is all personal." Leah leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of it all crashing down on her. She had expected Andrews to push back, but this? He was playing dirty, twisting the narrative to paint her as the villain. "Leah, are you there?" Harris asked after a moment of silence. "I'm here," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. "I'm just processing." "I'm sorry," Harris said, his voice softening. "But you can't let him win? You've got the truth on your side. We'll find a way to get through this." Leah nodded, even though Harris couldn't see her. "I know, but it's going to get ugly, isn't it?" Harris hesitated. "Yeah, it is." Leah ended the call, her mind spinning. She had known this fight would be difficult, but now she realized just how far Andrews was willing to go to protect himself. She would have to steel herself for what was coming. That evening, Leah sat in her father's living room, her fingers nervously tapping the armrest of the leather chair. James Carter sat across from her, his face lined with concern. He had just finished reading an early draft of the newspaper article set to run the next day. "It's not good," her father said, placing the article down on the coffee table. "They're framing this as a personal vendetta, making it sound like you're using my position to settle a score." Leah's stomach twisted. "I knew Andrews would fight dirty, but I didn't think it would go this far." Her father leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Leah, this is how people like him operate. When they're cornered, they deflect, distract, and attack. You need to be prepared for the backlash." Leah sighed, rubbing her temples. "I just want justice for Daniel. I didn't ask for any of this attention." "I know," her father said softly, "but this is bigger than Daniel now. Andrews is trying to discredit you, so no one will take your claims seriously. You need to fight back, on your terms." Leah looked up, her determination flickering back to life. "How?" "We'll release a statement. You'll need to stay ahead of the media. We'll make it clear that this isn't about my position or your personal connections. This is about justice, plain and simple. You've done everything by the book, and we'll make sure the public knows that." Leah nodded slowly, a plan forming in her mind. "You're right. We can't let him control the narrative." The next morning, Leah and her father drafted a statement to the press. It was direct, professional, and emphasized the legal facts of the case. Leah reiterated that her complaint was based on evidence of wrongdoing, not personal motivations. She wanted to ensure that the focus remained on Daniel's unjust arrest, not on her family ties. The statement was released just as the newspaper hit the stands, and Leah braced herself for the flood of reactions that would follow. But as the day wore on, something unexpected happened. People began to rally behind her. Within hours of the article's publication, Leah's inbox filled with messages of support. Emails from civil rights groups, local activists, and even strangers poured in, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. Social media buzzed with posts defending Leah and calling out Andrews' tactics. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Sophia Martinez, a well-known local journalist and advocate for police accountability. Sophia had been following the case closely and wanted to interview Leah for her independent news site. which focused on exposing corruption and amplifying underrepresented voices. Leah agreed to the interview, knowing it would be a chance to set the record straight and refocus the conversation on the injustice Daniel had faced. The interview took place later that week in a quiet corner of a local cafe. Sophia was sharp, thoughtful, and direct in her questions, but she also gave Leah the space to explain her side of the story. "This isn't about me," Leah said firmly, her hands resting on the table between them. "It's about a system that allows people like Captain Andrews to abuse their power without consequence. My friend Daniel was detained without cause. His rights were violated, and when I tried to seek justice, I was met with resistance and hostility. That's what this is about, holding those in power accountable." Sophia nodded, her pen moving quickly across her notebook. "And what do you say to those who claim you're using your father's position to influence the investigation?" Leah met her gaze, her voice steady. "I've followed the legal process every step of the way. My father's position has nothing to do with this complaint. The evidence speaks for itself, and I trust the investigation will reveal the truth." The interview was published the next day, and Leah's words resonated with readers. Comments flooded in, with many people sharing their own experiences of injustice at the hands of law enforcement. The tide of public opinion was beginning to shift in Leah's favor, and for the first time since this battle began, she felt like she wasn't alone. Despite the growing public support, Leah knew Andrews wasn't going to back down easily. Late one evening, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from an anonymous number, and though she hesitated to answer, curiosity got the better of her. "Leah Carter." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a familiar voice. "Miss Carter." Leah's pulse quickened. It was Captain Andrews. "What do you want?" Leah asked, her voice cold. "I want to make a deal," Andrews replied, his tone casual, but with an underlying edge. "This whole thing has gotten out of hand, don't you think?" Leah gripped her phone tighter. "You're the one who made it personal. I'm just trying to do what's right. And I'm offering you a way out," Andrews continued, ignoring her comment. "Drop the complaint, and this all goes away. You walk away, I walk away, and we both move on with our lives." Leah's blood boiled. "You think I'm going to just let you off the hook after everything you've done?" Andrews sighed, as though he were speaking to a child. "Look, I'm giving you a chance here. The investigation is a hassle for both of us. Let it go, and no one gets hurt." Leah's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not dropping the complaint, Captain. You violated Daniel's rights, and you're going to answer for that." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Andrews spoke again, his voice colder than before. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." The line went dead. Leah sat there for a moment, staring at her phone. She knew Andrews was bluffing, trying to intimidate her into backing down. But it only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't going to be bullied into silence. Not now. Not ever. The pressure mounted over the next few days. Leah's every move seemed to be watched. Reporters continued to hound her for statements, while the investigation into Captain Andrews' conduct slowly moved forward. She could feel the tension building, like a storm about to break. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Leah received a message from Harris. "Harris, there's something you need to see. Meet me at my office." Leah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door. When she arrived at the precinct, Harris met her in the parking lot, his expression serious. "What's going on?" Leah asked, her heart pounding. Harris handed her a file. "It's from Internal Affairs. They've been digging into Andrews' history. This isn't the first time he's been accused of misconduct." Leah flipped through the documents, her eyes widening as she read. There were multiple complaints against Andrews, all of them dismissed or swept under the rug. It was worse than she had imagined. "This is unbelievable," Leah muttered. "How has he gotten away with this for so long?" Harris shook his head. "He's been protected by his connections. But now that the investigation is official, those protections are starting to fall apart." Leah felt a surge of hope. This was the break they needed. With this evidence, the case against Andrews was stronger than ever. But as she looked up at Harris, she saw the worry in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Harris hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Be careful, Leah. Andrews is getting desperate. He knows he's losing control, and that makes him dangerous." Leah nodded, her resolve firm. "I'll be careful, but I'm not stopping now." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal filings, media appearances, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Leah stayed focused, working closely with Harris and the internal affairs team to build the strongest case possible against Captain Andrews. But the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Every day, Leah found herself fending off new attacks, both from the media and from Andrews himself. He had ramped up his smear campaign, planting stories that painted Leah as a spoiled rich girl trying to use her father's influence to settle personal scores. Despite the public support she had gained, the constant barrage of negativity was exhausting. Leah found herself waking up in the middle of the night, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Andrews had already threatened her once. What if he followed through? But Leah refused to let fear control her. She had come too far to back down now. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, and soon the truth would come out. As the storm swirled around her, Leah steeled herself for the final battle. She didn't know what Andrews had planned next, but whatever it was, she was ready. Leah sat in her office, reviewing the latest developments in the case against Captain Andrews. The pressure had not let up. Andrews had continued his attempts to discredit her, but the investigation was gaining momentum. The evidence was stacking up, and public support was growing. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the desk. The name that flashed across the screen surprised her. Sofia Martinez, the journalist who had interviewed her weeks earlier. "Sophia?" Leah answered, curious why the journalist would be calling again. "Leah, I think I can help you," Sophia said quickly, her voice filled with urgency. "I've been digging into Andrew's connections, and I found something you need to know." Leah's pulse quickened. "What is it? I can't talk over the phone. Can we meet?" Leah's mind raced. She trusted Sophia, but this was unexpected. "Where?" "There's a coffee shop on 5th and Main. Meet me there in an hour." Leah hung up the phone and grabbed her coat, her heart pounding in her chest. Sophia had been instrumental in keeping the public focused on the facts of the case, but if she had found something new, it could change everything. An hour later, Leah walked into the small, bustling cafe, scanning the room for Sophia. The journalist waved her over from a corner table, her expression serious. "Thanks for coming," Sophia said as Leah sat down. "What did you find?" Leah asked, unable to hide the urgency in her voice. Sophia slid a folder across the table. "Andrews has been working with certain city officials to cover up complaints. I've got records of internal memos, emails, everything. He's been manipulating the system for years, and he's had help from people in high places." Leah opened the folder and flipped through the documents. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the names. City council members, police board officials, people who had protected Andrews from consequences. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer anymore. This was about an entire network of influence. "This is huge," Leah whispered, feeling the weight of what Sophia had uncovered. "I know," Sophia replied. "And if you use this right, it could be the final blow. Andrews is powerful, but even he can't survive this level of exposure." Leah closed the folder, her mind racing. "Thank you, Sophia. I don't know how to repay you for this." "You don't need to," Sophia said with a small smile. "I'm just doing my job. And so are you." Armed with the new information, Leah felt a renewed sense of determination. She knew the case had taken a dangerous turn, but she also knew that this was the break they had been waiting for. The next morning, she met with Detective Ben Harris to discuss the new evidence. Harris's face darkened as he read through the documents. "This explains a lot," he muttered. "I knew Andrews had connections, but I didn't realize how deep they went." Leah nodded. "We need to use this. It's not just about getting Andrews off the streets. It's about exposing the entire system that's been enabling him." Harris looked up at her, his expression serious. "You realize this is going to make things even more dangerous, right? Andrews isn't going to go down without a fight, and now we're taking on more than just him." "I know," Leah said firmly, "but we can't stop now." Harris sighed, but there was a glint of admiration in his eyes. "You're a fighter, Leah. I respect that." Let's take this to internal affairs. If we move quickly, we can get the board involved before Andrews has a chance to cover his tracks." Leah felt a surge of hope. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they were truly on the offensive. That evening, Leah held a press conference outside the courthouse. Reporters gathered as she stood at the podium, a folder of documents in her hand. "Today, I'm presenting new evidence in the ongoing investigation into Captain Phil Andrews," Leah announced, her voice steady and clear. "This evidence reveals a network of corruption within the police department and the city's leadership, all designed to protect officers like Andrews from accountability. We will not let this continue." The crowd of reporters erupted into questions, but Leah stayed composed, answering only what she needed to. She knew the public had her back now, and with Sophia's help, the truth was spreading like wildfire. That night, social media buzzed with support. Community groups organized protests demanding reform, and civil rights organizations rallied behind Leah's efforts. The city was waking up, and the momentum was building. In the days that followed, the investigation into Captain Andrews expanded to include several other high-ranking officials. The case had become much bigger than Leah had ever anticipated. She knew they were on the brink of a major breakthrough, but she also knew that the danger was growing. Leah found herself looking over her shoulder more often. There were moments when she felt like someone was watching her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Andrews had something planned. She was more careful now, always keeping her phone close, always making sure she wasn't alone when she walked to her car. One evening, after a long day at the office, Leah received a call from her father. His voice was calm, but she could hear the underlying tension. "Leah, I'm proud of what you're doing," Mayor James Carter said. "But you need to be careful. Andrews has friends in places you wouldn't expect. You've made a lot of powerful enemies." Leah sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know, Dad, but I can't stop now. We're too close." "I just want you to be safe," her father said quietly. "Don't underestimate the lengths these people will go to protect themselves." Leah's heart tightened. She knew her father was right. The investigation had grown into something far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. But she couldn't let fear stop her. "I'll be careful," Leah promised. "But I'm not giving up." The day of the city council hearing arrived. Leah sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding as the council members filed into the room. This was it, the moment they had been building toward for weeks. Captain Andrews would finally be held accountable for his actions, and Leah was ready to see justice served. As the hearing began, Leah watched as Andrews took the stand. He looked different today, less confident, more defensive. The weight of the investigation had clearly taken its toll on him, and for the first time, Leah saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. The council members asked Andrews to respond to the allegations of corruption and misconduct. He stumbled through his answers, deflecting blame and denying any wrongdoing. But the evidence was overwhelming, and it was clear that the council wasn't buying his excuses. Leah sat silently, her heart racing as the tension in the room escalated. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now it was finally here. The council had the power to remove Andrews from his position, to strip him of his authority, and to hold him accountable for the harm he had caused. As the hearing drew to a close, the council members took a brief recess to deliberate. Leah waited anxiously, her mind racing with possibilities. This was the turning point. Everything she had fought for hinged on the decision the council was about to make. The council members returned to their seats, the room falling into a tense silence. Leah held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could see the strain on Andrew's face as he awaited their verdict. After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from all parties, the lead council member began, "We have come to a decision regarding Captain Phil Andrews." Leah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. It is the decision of this council that Captain Andrews be removed from his position, effective immediately. Furthermore, we recommend that an independent investigation be launched into the broader allegations of corruption within the department. Leah felt a rush of relief so powerful that she could hardly breathe. The room erupted into murmurs, and Leah caught sight of Andrews, his face pale and his hands trembling. He had lost. As the council adjourned, Leah stood, her body buzzing with adrenaline. She had done it. Andrews had been removed, and the city was finally taking steps toward accountability and reform. It wasn't over yet. The broader investigation would take time, but this was a major victory. As Leah walked out of the courthouse, a group of supporters and activists gathered outside, cheering and holding signs calling for justice. For the first time in weeks, Leah allowed herself to smile. She had won the first battle, and now she was ready for whatever came next. The sound of the gavel closing the city council hearing echoed in Leah's ears as she stepped out of the courthouse. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the crowd gathered outside. For a moment, Leah allowed herself to feel the weight of victory. Captain Phil Andrews had been removed from his position, and justice, at least in part, had been served. But Leah knew this was only the beginning. The corruption uncovered in the investigation went far deeper than Andrews. The city's leadership had been complicit, and now, as news of Andrews' removal spread, Leah could feel the tension building. There were still powerful people who had much to lose if the investigation continued. Detective Ben Harris appeared beside her, giving her a nod of approval. "You did it," he said, his voice a mixture of pride and relief. "We did it," Leah corrected, smiling. "But we're not done." Harris's face grew serious. "No, we're not. This is going to shake up a lot of people, and not all of them are going to be happy about it." Leah nodded. She knew that Andrews' removal was a blow to the corrupt system, but the real fight was just beginning. The investigation would now turn to the network of city officials and police officers who had protected Andrews for years. As she walked toward her car, Leah's phone buzzed. It was Sophia Martinez, the journalist who had helped uncover the key evidence. "Sophia? Congratulations, Leah. I heard the news. This is a huge win." Leah smiled and texted back quickly. "Leah, thanks. Couldn't have done it without your help." But as she slid her phone back into her purse, Leah couldn't shake the feeling that this victory had put her, and everyone involved, into even more danger. The next few days were a whirlwind of media coverage, interviews, and meetings with internal affairs. Leah's name was now synonymous with the fight against corruption. And while that brought her a lot of support from the community, it also put a target on her back. Leah had received several anonymous emails warning her to back off, but she had learned to ignore them. They were just the desperate attempts of people who knew their time was running out. But something about this particular morning felt different. When she arrived at her office, a thick envelope sat on her desk. No return address. Leah's stomach tightened. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the contents. Inside was a series of photographs, pictures of her, her father, and even Ben Harris, all taken over the past few days. Leah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was being watched. Attached to the photos was a handwritten note. "You're in over your head. Drop this case, or we won't just be watching." Leah's breath caught in her throat. She had been threatened before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about intimidation anymore. This was a promise of something worse. She grabbed her phone and dialed Ben Harris's number. "Ben, I need to talk to you." "It's urgent," Leah said, her voice shaking. Later that day, Leah met Harris in a quiet park, far away from the prying eyes of the precinct or her office. She handed him the envelope, her fingers still trembling. Harris's face darkened as he looked through the photos. "This isn't just a warning," he said grimly. "They're escalating. They know they're losing control, and they're getting desperate." Leah nodded, her fear mixing with anger. "What do we do? If they're willing to go this far—" We keep going," Harris said firmly. "We're close to cracking this wide open. We can't stop now." Leah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I won't stop," she said, her voice firmer. "But we need to be careful. Whoever's behind this won't go down without a fight." Harris nodded. "I'll keep an eye on things. And Leah, watch your back. This is going to get worse before it gets better." As Leah and Harris intensified their efforts, the investigation expanded rapidly. More names began to surface. Officials who had covered for Andrews, officers who had been part of his inner circle, and even a few city council members who had turned a blind eye to the corruption within the police department. Leah spent hours combing through documents, interviewing witnesses, and coordinating with internal affairs. The deeper she dug, the more horrifying the truth became. The system was rotten from the inside, and it wasn't just Andrews who had abused his power. It was an entire network of people who had enabled him. But as the investigation gained momentum, so did the threats. Leah received more anonymous letters, cryptic phone calls in the middle of the night, and unsettling encounters with strangers who seemed to know far too much about her personal life. One evening, Leah arrived home to find her front door slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she cautiously stepped inside, calling out for anyone who might be there. But the house was empty, except for one thing. In the middle of her living room, sitting on the coffee table, was a single photograph of her father, taken just hours earlier. Leah's hands shook as she picked up the photo, a wave of fear washing over her. This was no longer just about her. They were going after her family. Leah sat in her father's living room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Mayor James Carter sat across from her, his expression grave. She had told him about the threats, about the photographs, about the feeling of being watched. He listened quietly, his face lined with worry. "I can't let this go on, Dad," Leah said, her voice tight with frustration. "They're targeting you now. I'm putting you in danger." Her father shook his head. "Leah, you're doing the right thing. I've dealt with threats before. It's part of the job." "Not like this," Leah said, her voice rising. "This is different. These people will do anything to protect themselves." James Carter leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Leah, listen to me. I'm proud of you. What you're doing is important, and it's going to make a real difference. But you can't let fear stop you. If we give in now, they win." Leah's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She hated that she was afraid, but the thought of something happening to her father was too much to bear. "I just don't know how much more of this I can take," Leah whispered. Her father reached across the table, taking her hand. "You've already done more than most people ever would. But if you need to take a step back, I'll understand." Leah shook her head. "No, I can't stop now. Not when we're so close." Her father smiled softly, pride shining in his eyes. "Then keep going, but be careful, and know that you're not alone in this." Leah's determination hardened after that conversation. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, and the internal affairs team was preparing to make its final recommendations. But as the pressure mounted, so did the danger. One evening, as Leah was driving home from a meeting with Harris, her car was forced off the road by a black SUV. The vehicle swerved in front of her, forcing her to slam on the brakes. The SUV sped off before she could catch a glimpse of the driver. But Leah knew it wasn't an accident. The message was clear: back off, or things would get worse. Shaken but undeterred, Leah reported the incident to Harris, who immediately arranged for additional security. But Leah refused to hide. She had come too far to back down now, and she wasn't about to let them scare her into silence. The investigation's final report was set to be released in a week, and Leah knew that once it was, the city would never be the same. The corrupt officials who had protected Andrews for years were about to be exposed, and justice, real justice, was finally within reach. As Leah prepared for the final stretch, she knew the fight wasn't over. The threats would continue, and the danger was far from gone. But she had learned something important along the way. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing up in the face of it. And Leah Carter wasn't going to back down. The night after Leah's car was forced off the road, she couldn't sleep. The incident replayed in her mind. The flash of the black SUV, the screech of her brakes, the sheer terror of losing control. She had never been so close to real danger before, and the weight of that realization settled over her like a heavy blanket. But more than fear, it was the simmering anger that kept her awake. They were trying to silence her, to make her give up, and it was working, at least in part. But she couldn't let them win. Not now. Leah stared at the ceiling of her apartment, her mind racing with thoughts of how far the corruption extended. She had learned through the investigation that it wasn't just about Captain Andrews anymore. His removal had sent ripples through the system, and now the entire network of people who had benefited from his cover-ups was beginning to crumble. But with that crumbling came danger. The next morning, Leah walked into the office, greeted by the familiar sounds of phone calls and clicking keyboards. She was exhausted, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Harris was waiting for her in her office, his expression more serious than usual. "I've arranged for extra security," Harris said, his voice low. "After what happened last night, we can't take any more chances." Leah nodded, grateful but still unsettled. "Thanks, Ben, but I don't want this to slow us down. The report comes out in a week, and we need to be ready for whatever happens." "We're ready," Harris assured her. "But be careful, Leah. Whoever's behind this won't go down quietly. They're cornered, and that makes them dangerous." Leah knew he was right. The more they exposed, the more desperate their enemies would become. But she had come too far to back down now. Leah and Harris worked tirelessly over the next few days, piecing together the final bits of evidence for the report. Internal Affairs had already gathered most of the key information, but Leah's persistence had uncovered more damning documents, emails between Captain Andrews and several high-ranking officials, proving a concerted effort to shield officers from accountability. The report, set to be released at the end of the week, would include these findings. Leah knew that when it was made public, it would send shockwaves through the city. As they reviewed the final documents, Harris glanced at Leah, his eyes tired but determined. "This is going to change everything, you know," he said quietly. "Not just for Andrews, but for the whole department. The fallout is going to be huge." Leah nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "That's the point, right? To force change?" Harris gave her a small smile. "Yeah, but sometimes change comes at a price." Leah didn't need to ask what that price was. She had already seen it. The threats, the near-death experiences, the fear that had become a constant companion. But the cost of doing nothing would be even higher. The night before the report was scheduled to be released, Leah sat in her apartment, staring at the city skyline. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Tomorrow, the city would know everything. The corruption, the cover-ups, the people who had been complicit in protecting Andrews, all of it would be laid bare. Leah had always been someone who believed in the power of truth. But tonight, she wondered if that belief would be enough. Would the truth really be enough to bring down a system that had been entrenched for so long? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was her father. "How are you feeling?" James Carter's voice was soft, but Leah could hear the concern in it. "Tired," Leah admitted. "Nervous. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow." Her father paused for a moment before replying. "You've done everything you can. You fought for the truth, and now it's time to let it speak for itself." Leah smiled, even though he couldn't see her. "Thanks, Dad." "You're stronger than you think, Leah," her father continued. "Whatever happens tomorrow, just remember that." After hanging up, Leah stared out the window again, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Tomorrow was going to be the most important day of her life, and the lives of countless others. The morning of the report's release was chaotic. Leah arrived at the office to find a swarm of reporters already gathered outside. Word had spread about the investigation's findings, and everyone wanted to be the first to break the story. Leah and Harris stood in front of the cameras, both of them calm but tense as they prepared for the onslaught of questions. As the official report was released to the public, the truth finally came out. The report detailed years of corruption within the police department. Illegal arrests, cover-ups, and intimidation tactics used to silence anyone who tried to speak out. It implicated not only Captain Andrews, but several other high-ranking officials who had worked behind the scenes to protect him. Leah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as she watched the reporters scramble to get the story out. The truth was out there now. There was no going back. As Leah gave her statement to the press, she remained composed, speaking clearly about the need for reform and accountability. But beneath the surface, her mind raced. What would happen now? Would the city rise up and demand change, or would the powers that be find a way to protect themselves yet again? When the press conference ended, Leah walked back inside, feeling drained but proud. She had done it. The truth was out. That night, Leah returned home expecting a moment of peace. But as soon as she stepped inside, her phone rang. It was Harris. Leah, you need to leave your apartment. Now. Leah's heart skipped a beat. What? Why? There's been chatter, Harris said quickly. Whoever's behind this isn't done. I don't know the details, but I've got a bad feeling. Get out of there! Leah's pulse raced as she grabbed her coat and keys, rushing out the door. She had trusted Harris throughout this entire ordeal, and if he said she was in danger, she believed him. As she drove through the quiet streets, her mind raced. The report had gone public, but it seemed that her enemies weren't finished with her yet. What would they do next? Leah made her way to a safe house that Harris had arranged for her. A small, inconspicuous apartment on the outskirts of the city. As she sat in the darkness, her phone buzzed with notifications, news outlets covering the report, messages of support from friends and allies. But Leah knew that this wasn't over. The people behind the corruption had too much to lose, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. As she sat there in the silence, Leah realized that the fight for justice was far from over. The report had exposed the truth, but now she had to survive the fallout. Leah sat in the small, dimly lit apartment that Detective Harris had secured for her, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. The truth had been exposed. Captain Andrews had been removed, and the investigation had pulled back the curtain on the corruption within the city. But instead of feeling victorious, Leah felt more vulnerable than ever. The threats had escalated, and the warning from Harris earlier that night had sent her into hiding. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, news alerts, texts from friends, messages from supporters. But Leah couldn't focus on any of them. She kept replaying Harris's words in her head. Get out of there. Now. Whoever was behind these threats wasn't just trying to scare her anymore. They were making their final move, and Leah had no idea how far they were willing to go. The sound of a car pulling up outside jolted her from her thoughts. Leah's heart raced as she cautiously peeked out the window. It was Harris. She exhaled in relief, unlocking the door and letting him in. We don't have much time, Harris said, his voice low and urgent. Things are moving fast. The people who've been protecting Andrews, they're not going to sit back and let this all fall apart. Leah nodded, her pulse quickening. What do we do? Harris ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. I've been hearing things, rumors that they're planning to discredit the entire investigation. They're trying to get ahead of this before the fallout hits them. Leah's stomach twisted. You mean they're going to fabricate evidence? Worse than that, Harris said grimly. They might try to pin something on you. Leah stared at him, disbelief coursing through her. On me? How? They're desperate, Leah. They've already tried to intimidate you, but now they're going to try to ruin your credibility. They're going to make it look like you were involved in some kind of scandal, something that'll take the heat off them. Leah's mind raced. She had known the people behind Andrews were powerful, but this was a new level of danger. They were willing to destroy her reputation, her career, everything she had worked for, just to protect themselves. We need to get ahead of this, Leah said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. We need to expose them before they can frame me for something I didn't do. Harris nodded, his expression serious. I've got a plan, but it's risky. We're going to need to move fast. The next morning, Leah and Harris put their plan into motion. They had one chance to strike back before the people behind Andrews could sabotage her. Leah knew she had to act quickly, and this time it wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about saving herself. Harris had managed to get access to a series of encrypted communications between city officials. Emails, text messages, phone records that linked several key figures to the efforts to cover for Andrews. They had been careful, but not careful enough. Harris had found the smoking gun, a conversation between two council members discussing how to shield Andrews from the investigation. Even as it became clear that his downfall was inevitable. We release this, Harris said, showing Leah the documents, and they won't be able to recover. It's proof that they've been orchestrating the cover-up from the inside. Leah stared at the screen, her heart pounding. This was it, the evidence they needed to bring the entire network down. But releasing it wasn't going to be easy. The people involved in the conspiracy had deep pockets and even deeper connections. They could suppress this if it wasn't handled carefully. Leah knew she had to be strategic. We need to release this to someone who can protect it, someone who won't be intimidated. I've already made contact with a national news outlet, Harris said. They're ready to publish the story, but we need to make sure it goes public all at once, before they can stop us. Leah nodded, feeling the adrenaline surge through her veins. Then let's do it. That evening, the bombshell dropped. The national news outlet published the full story, complete with the leaked communications, the details of the cover-up, and the names of every official involved. The headline was explosive. City corruption exposed. High-ranking officials protected disgraced Captain Andrews. The reaction was immediate. Social media erupted with outrage, and within hours, the story was the top headline on every major news channel. There was no stopping it now. The people who had tried to silence Leah were scrambling to contain the damage, but it was too late. The truth was out. Leah watched the coverage unfold from the safe house, her heart racing. This was what she had been fighting for. The moment when everything came crashing down on the people who had abused their power for so long. But as the headlines rolled in, Leah knew the battle wasn't over yet. The people behind Andrews weren't just going to accept defeat. They would fight back, and they would be more dangerous than ever. As Leah watched the fallout from the exposé, the threats against her intensified. Anonymous calls, messages, and veiled warnings flooded her phone. But there was something else, a growing sense of paranoia that Leah couldn't shake. She knew they were still out there, watching her, waiting for their next move. Harris had arranged for extra security, but Leah couldn't help feeling like a target. The people she had exposed had too much at stake, and now that they were cornered, Leah feared what they might do next. One afternoon, Leah was walking through the quiet streets near the safe house, trying to clear her head. As she turned a corner, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It wasn't unusual, just a car, but something about it made her pause. The windows were tinted, and the engine was running. Leah's pulse quickened. She could feel eyes on her. Trying to remain calm, she picked up her pace, walking faster down the block. But the car didn't move. It just sat there, watching. When Leah finally reached the safe house, she rushed inside and locked the door behind her, her heart racing. She was being followed. There was no doubt about it. She immediately called Harris, her voice shaking as she recounted what had happened. "Stay inside," Harris said firmly. "I'll send someone over to check it out. Don't go anywhere until I get there." Leah hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She had known this fight would be dangerous, but now the reality of it was sinking in. These people weren't just trying to scare her anymore, they were hunting her. That night, Harris arrived at the safe house, along with 2 other detectives who had been working on the case. They sat around the small kitchen table reviewing the latest developments and trying to piece together what the next move would be. "We've exposed them," Harris said, his voice low. "But they're not going down without a fight. They've got too much to lose." Leah nodded, her hands still shaking from the encounter earlier. "What do we do now?" "We need to push for arrests," one of the detectives said. "We've got enough evidence now. The DA is on board, but we need to make sure these people are taken into custody before they have a chance to disappear." Leah's heart pounded. The stakes had never been higher. This was it, the moment when everything would either fall apart or come together. As the night wore on, Leah and Harris worked tirelessly to finalize the case. By the early morning hours, they had everything in place. Warrants were issued, and within hours, the arrests began. Several high-ranking officials were taken into custody, including the 2 council members who had been at the center of the cover-up. The news spread like wildfire, and by midday, the city was in shock. The people who had once been untouchable were now facing justice. The city was buzzing with the news of the arrests, and Leah could finally feel the weight lifting from her shoulders. It wasn't over yet. There would be trials, hearings, and months of legal battles ahead. But for the first time, Leah felt like they had won. She had faced threats, intimidation, and danger at every turn, but she had refused to back down. And now justice was finally being served. As she sat in the quiet of the safe house, watching the news coverage of the arrests, Leah felt a deep sense of relief. The corruption that had plagued the city for years was being dismantled piece by piece. It wasn't a complete victory, there was still work to be done, but it was a start. Harris called later that evening, his voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "You did it, Leah." "We did it." Leah smiled, exhaustion washing over her. "I couldn't have done it without you." "There's still a long road ahead," Harris said, his tone more serious now. "But we've taken down the worst of them. The city owes you a debt of gratitude." Leah hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the past few months slowly lifting. She had fought for the truth, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. As she stared out the window at the darkening sky, Leah knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice would never truly be over, but now she was ready for whatever came next. The city was still reeling from the arrests of several high-ranking officials. Leah's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from reporters, supporters, and even a few former adversaries who now realized just how deep the corruption ran. She had become a symbol of integrity and courage, someone who had dared to stand up against the seemingly untouchable forces of power. But as the dust began to settle, Leah couldn't shake the feeling of lingering tension. Despite the arrests, there were still whispers in the dark corners of the city, rumors that not everyone involved in the conspiracy had been caught. Some of the most dangerous figures remained hidden, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Leah met with Harris in his office, their exhaustion visible on both their faces. "You did it, Leah," Harris said, a note of pride in his voice. "The city's changed because of you." Leah offered a small smile. "We did it, Ben. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not over, though. We've taken out the top players, but there's still more cleanup to do. People are going to try to distance themselves from this, pretend they weren't involved." Leah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I know, but we've laid the groundwork. Now we have to make sure the reforms stick." Harris agreed. "There's going to be pushback. People don't like change, especially when it threatens their comfort. But we've got momentum now. Let's not lose it." Leah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. In the quiet of her apartment, away from the media frenzy and the constant phone calls, she allowed herself to process everything that had happened. She thought back to the beginning, Daniel's wrongful arrest, her first encounter with Captain Andrews, and the humiliation she had felt when her voice was dismissed. It seemed like a lifetime ago. So much had changed since then. She had changed. Leah's phone buzzed with a message from her father. "James Carter. I'm proud of you, Leah. You've done more than anyone could have asked for." Leah smiled softly. Her father's support had been a constant source of strength throughout this ordeal. But now she realized something important. She wasn't just fighting because she was the mayor's daughter. She was fighting for justice, for people like Daniel, and for all the others who had been silenced by the system. As Leah looked out at the city skyline, she felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. The fight wasn't over, but she had made a difference. And that, more than anything, was enough for now. The city council convened weeks later to address the fallout from the corruption scandal. Leah had been invited to speak before the council, her reputation as a champion for justice cemented by the recent events. As she walked into the grand chamber, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was the result of everything she had fought for. Change, real change. The room was packed with reporters, city officials, and members of the community. Leah could feel their eyes on her as she made her way to the front, the weight of their expectations settling on her shoulders. But she wasn't nervous. She knew what needed to be said. "Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak today," Leah began, her voice steady and clear. "Over the past few months, we've seen the unraveling of a system that for too long has operated without accountability, but the arrests and the exposure of corruption are only the beginning. We cannot let this be the end of our efforts. We must continue to push for reform to ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated." The room was silent as Leah continued, her words carrying the weight of her experience. "This city belongs to all of us, and it's up to each of us to make sure that justice is not just a word, but a reality. The changes we make today will shape the future for generations to come." As Leah finished her speech, the room erupted into applause. She felt a surge of emotion, relief, pride, and a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she had fought so hard. Not just for justice in one case, but for a better future for everyone. The months that followed were a blur of new developments. The city launched an independent commission to oversee police reform, and Leah was asked to serve as an advisor on the board. Her role was pivotal, ensuring that the lessons learned from the corruption scandal would lead to lasting changes in how the city operated. Leah threw herself into the work. It wasn't glamorous, and the opposition was fierce, but she knew it was important. The commission's efforts focused on transparency, accountability, and community engagement, with a renewed emphasis on building trust between law enforcement and the citizens they were sworn to protect. Meanwhile, the legal cases against the officials arrested in the scandal moved forward. Leah watched as one by one, those who had once seemed untouchable were held accountable for their actions. It was a long, grueling process, but it was necessary. In quieter moments, Leah allowed herself to reflect on what had been accomplished. The city was different now. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was moving in the right direction. People were paying attention, and that in itself was a victory. One afternoon, Leah visited Daniel Richards, the friend whose wrongful arrest had started this entire journey. They sat in a small cafe, sipping coffee and catching up on each other's lives. Daniel had moved on from the trauma of his arrest, but the experience had left its mark on both of them. "I still can't believe everything that's happened because of that night," Daniel said, shaking his head. "I mean, you took down an entire corrupt system." Leah smiled softly. "It wasn't just me. A lot of people helped, and there's still a lot of work to do." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, but you didn't back down. You fought for me, for everyone. I'll never forget that." Leah's heart swelled with gratitude. "I fought because it was the right thing to do, and I'll keep fighting for as long as it takes." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through lingering in the air. "You're going to keep doing this, aren't you?" Daniel asked, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. Leah chuckled. "Yeah, I guess I am. There's still so much work to be done, but I'm ready for it." As they finished their coffee, Leah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a lawyer or the daughter of the mayor. She was someone who had stood up for justice when it mattered most. And she wasn't done yet. The fight for justice was ongoing, but Leah Carter had learned something important along the way. Change doesn't come easily, but it comes, and as long as she kept pushing, she knew that the truth would always prevail. Months passed, and life in the city began to settle into a new rhythm. The reforms that Leah had fought for were starting to take hold, though progress was slow and often met with resistance. Still, there was a palpable sense that change was finally in the air. Leah had stepped into a new role as an advisor on the Independent Police Commission, working alongside others who were just as committed to rooting out corruption and ensuring accountability. Leah often found herself reflecting on how far they had come. The public hearings, the arrests, the media storm, it all felt like a distant memory, though the scars of the battle still lingered. She had sacrificed so much, but the victory was undeniable. Captain Andrews and the network of corrupt officials had been dismantled, their influence shattered. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a step toward something better. One afternoon, Leah stood in her new office at the commission headquarters, gazing out the window at the city skyline. The view was familiar, yet everything felt different now. She had helped shape this city's future, and while there was still much work to be done, Leah couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Harris. "Harris, coffee at our spot? I need a break from the chaos." Leah smiled as she texted back. "Leah, meet you there in 15. At the cafe, Leah found Harris sitting at a small table near the window, 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He looked tired but content, his usual sharpness softened by the months of hard work they had put in. "You know," Harris said as Leah sat down, "I didn't think we'd make it this far." Leah chuckled softly, taking a sip of her coffee. "Neither did I." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the journey they had shared. "You've done a hell of a job, Leah," Harris said, his tone serious. "Not just with the commission, but with everything. You took on the system, and you won." Leah shook her head, her smile bittersweet. "It wasn't just me. You were there every step of the way." "Maybe," Harris said, leaning back in his chair. "But you led the charge, and now the city's better because of it." Leah didn't say anything for a moment, letting his words sink in. She had never sought the spotlight, but now she understood that her role in all of this had been bigger than she ever could have imagined. And while the fight had been exhausting, it had been worth it. In the weeks that followed, Leah focused on finding balance in her life again. For so long, her world had been consumed by the fight for justice. But now that the immediate danger had passed, she was learning how to breathe again. The city was no longer in constant turmoil, and Leah found solace in the quieter moments, spending time with her father, reconnecting with old friends, and allowing herself the space to heal from everything she had been through. Her relationship with her father, James Carter, had grown even stronger over the course of the investigation. He had always been her rock, but now Leah understood the depth of his wisdom in a way she hadn't before. His guidance had helped her stay grounded, even in the darkest moments. One evening, Leah and her father sat on the porch of his house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was warm, and the sounds of the city buzzed faintly in the background. "I'm proud of you, Leah," her father said, his voice steady. "I don't say it enough, but I've always known you were meant to do something great." Leah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done any of this without you." They sat in peaceful silence, both of them knowing that the hardest part of the journey was behind them. But Leah also knew that her fight wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more battles to fight, but for now, she could rest in the knowledge that she had made a real difference. As the months turned into a year, the reforms in the city continued to take shape. The independent police commission that Leah had helped establish was now fully operational, with regular oversight and community involvement. The changes weren't easy. There was pushback from within the department, and the transition to a more transparent and accountable system was often slow. But Leah remained committed to the cause. One of the most significant changes was the creation of a civilian oversight board, something Leah had advocated for from the beginning. The board, made up of community leaders, activists, and legal experts, had the authority to review police actions and recommend disciplinary measures. It was a major step toward restoring trust between law enforcement and the public. Leah continued her work with the commission, but she also began to explore new opportunities. She had always been passionate about civil rights, and now she saw a path forward in helping other cities implement similar reforms. Her reputation as a reformer had grown, and she was frequently invited to speak at conferences and workshops across the country, sharing her experiences and advocating for justice. But no matter where her work took her, Leah never forgot where it all started. The wrongful arrest of Daniel Richards had set everything in motion, and Leah remained in close contact with Daniel, who had become a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform. They met often to discuss new initiatives and strategies for keeping the momentum going. Daniel had turned his experience into a platform for change, and together, he and Leah were making sure that the lessons learned from the corruption scandal weren't forgotten. As Leah's work gained national recognition, she found herself becoming more and more involved in broader movements for criminal justice reform. She was invited to Washington, D.C. to testify before a congressional committee on police accountability, where she spoke about the importance of transparency and the need for systemic change. Her testimony made waves, and soon Leah was being sought out by lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and activists looking for guidance on how to bring meaningful reform to their own communities. She knew the road ahead was long, but she was ready for the challenge. One day, while preparing for another public speaking event, Leah received a letter in the mail. It was from a young woman in another state who had heard Leah's story and had been inspired to fight for justice in her own community. The letter was simple, but it touched Leah deeply. Your courage gave me the strength to stand up. Thank you for showing me that one voice can make a difference. Leah read the letter over and over, a smile spreading across her face. She had never set out to be a symbol, but now she realized that her fight had inspired others to take up the mantle of justice. And that was a legacy she was proud of. A year after the corruption scandal had rocked the city, Leah stood at the site of a new community center, built in the heart of the neighborhood most affected by the events. The center was a symbol of healing and hope, a place where citizens and law enforcement could come together to rebuild trust and work toward a better future. Leah had been invited to the opening ceremony, and as she stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. So many people had come together to make this happen, to turn a moment of darkness into a catalyst for change. Today is about more than just this building, Leah said, her voice clear and strong. It's about what we've accomplished together. We've shown that when we stand up for what's right, we can make a real difference. This community is proof that change is possible and that it's worth fighting for. As the crowd applauded, Leah stepped down from the podium, her heart full. She spotted Daniel in the audience, smiling proudly. Beside him was Detective Harris, who gave her a knowing nod. They had been through so much together, and now they were seeing the fruits of their labor. Leah walked over to them, feeling lighter than she had in years. You did it, Daniel said, pulling her into a hug. We did it, Leah corrected, smiling warmly. All of us. As the sun set over the city, Leah felt a deep sense of peace. The fight for justice was never truly over, but today she could rest easy knowing that they had come full circle. The city had changed, and so had she. Leah Carter had stood against corruption, faced down threats, and emerged stronger than ever. And now, as she looked toward the future, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. As Leah stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the sun set over a city forever changed, she couldn't help but smile. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but standing here, she knew the fight for justice had been worth it. Leah turned to her friends, her heart swelling with pride. The work wasn't done, but the future looked brighter than ever. And just like Leah's story, there are many more battles ahead. Stories of courage, perseverance, and the pursuit of truth. To continue following these powerful stories of justice and change, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay with us for more inspiring journeys and be part of a community that stands up for what's right. Together, we can make a difference.